You know what really pisses me off about humans? Ambassador Carax chittered, his mandibles clacking in frustration as he nursed his third glass of fermented nectar. They're just so nice about everything. His drinking companion, a retired unified species military commander named Vexthra, let out a warbling laugh that caused her throat sacs to ripple with iridescent colors. Nice? That's what bothers you about the Deathworlders? Not the fact that they can survive things that would kill most species instantly. Not their terrifying endurance or their ability to recover from injuries that should be fatal. No, you're missing the point, Carax insisted, gesturing emphatically with one of his secondary arms. It's the niceness that's the problem. Because they're so goddamned reasonable about everything, most species have forgotten what they're actually capable of. Did you know they deliberately undersell their abilities in most diplomatic meetings? They do it to avoid making other species uncomfortable. The bar they were sitting in, the Wayward Nebula, was one of the few establishments in the galactic core that catered to both standard gravity species and heavy-worlders. It had become something of an unofficial neutral ground for various diplomatic corps members to drink away their frustrations after particularly trying negotiations. Today, it was relatively quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered across its various gravity-segregated sections. Vexthra's scales shifted to a contemplative blue as she considered Carax's words. You know, I was there during the Hradek incident, before the humans joined the Unified Species Council. Back when everyone thought they were just another primitive civilization that had somehow stumbled onto FTL travel. Carax's antennae perked up with interest. The Hradek incident was rarely discussed in official channels, and most of the records from that time had been classified at the highest levels. I've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. What actually happened? What happened, Vexthra said, leaning forward, is that we learned exactly why humans spend so much energy being nice. She signaled the bartender for another round before continuing. Have you ever wondered why the Kenthar Empire, one of the most aggressive species in known space, suddenly became so cooperative with human diplomatic initiatives about 30 cycles ago? I always assumed it was because humans demonstrated some new technology or military capability that convinced them to back down, Carax admitted. Vexthra's scales rippled with dark amusement. Oh, they demonstrated something all right, but it wasn't technology. She paused to take a long drink. The Kenthar had been raiding human colonies, testing their defenses. Standard procedure for them back then. They did it to everyone. Humans sent diplomatic protests, requested meetings, tried to establish peaceful contact. All very reasonable, very nice. Let me guess, Carax interrupted. The Kenthar saw it as weakness? Exactly. So they decided to make an example of one of the smaller human colonies, Hradek, population of about 20,000. The Kenthar sent in their elite forces, expecting an easy victory that would teach humans their place in the galaxy. Vexthra's scales had shifted to a deep purple, a color Carax had never seen on her before. I was part of the USC observation force dispatched to monitor the situation. Standard procedure. Observe and document, but don't interfere. Nobody wanted to get involved in a conflict with the Kenthar Empire. What happened to the colony? Carax asked, though something in Vexthra's tone made him suspect he already knew the answer. The humans evacuated it, just packed up and left before the Kenthar arrived. Very orderly, very efficient. The Kenthar were furious. They'd been denied their show of force, so they destroyed the empty colony anyway, and broadcast it across all frequencies as a warning to humanity. Carax's mandibles twitched in confusion. But that's not the whole story, is it? That wouldn't have been enough to change the Kenthar's entire diplomatic stance. No, Vexthra agreed, her scales now pulsing with an almost black undertone. That's not what changed things. What changed things was what happened 3 days later, when every single Kenthar raiding base within 50 light-years of human space went dark, simultaneously. She took another drink before continuing. The humans had spent those 3 days giving the Kenthar a chance to apologize and make reparations. Very reasonable demands, very nice. When the Kenthar refused, humanity decided to stop being nice. What did they do? Carax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's the thing. Nobody knows exactly. The bases weren't destroyed. There were no signs of weapons fire, no radiation, no conventional battle damage. They were just empty. Every single Kenthar warrior, every piece of portable technology, every scrap of tactical data, gone. The only things left were the base structures themselves and a single message painted on the wall of each command center. Nice isn't the same as weak. Carax felt his extremities go cold. But that's thousands of warriors. Elite Ninthar warriors. How did they just disappear? The humans never explained, and the Canthar never asked. They signed a peace treaty the next day. It's still the fastest diplomatic agreement ever recorded in USC history. Vexthra's scales had returned to their normal coloring. That's when I understood something fundamental about humans. They're not nice because they're weak. They're nice because they're strong enough that they don't need to prove anything. But what happened to the Canthar warriors? Carax pressed. 3 months later, they all showed up on their homeworld. Every single one of them, alive and unharmed. None of them would talk about what happened, but every one of them had been changed. They'd seen something that fundamentally altered their understanding of their place in the universe. Vexthra finished her drink. The Canthar Empire immediately implemented massive reforms in their military and diplomatic corps. They've been one of humanity's strongest allies ever since. Carax sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Why isn't this common knowledge? Why keep it classified? Because the humans requested it, Vexthra said simply. Said there was no need to embarrass the Canthar or create unnecessary tension. Very nice of them, wouldn't you say? Before Carax could respond, the bar's main door slid open with a soft hiss. A human diplomat he recognized, Sarah Chen from the Terra Prime Embassy, walked in, looking exhausted but smiling warmly at the various patrons. "Ambassador Chen!" Carax called out, perhaps a bit more loudly than necessary. "Join us for a drink?" The human walked over to their table, her smile widening. "Thank you, Ambassador Carax. That would be lovely." She settled into one of the reinforced chairs designed for human use. "I just spent 6 hours negotiating trade routes with the ZXV consortium. I could definitely use a drink." "Successful negotiations?" Vexthra asked, her scales shifting to a friendly green. "Oh yes, very productive," Sarah said cheerfully. "We managed to find a compromise that works for everyone. They were quite reasonable once we explained our position." Carax and Vexthra exchanged a knowing look. "Very nice of them," Carax said carefully. Sarah's smile took on a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. "Yes," she agreed, her voice still perfectly pleasant. "Very nice indeed." Vexthra's scales flickered briefly to that deep purple again before returning to normal. The three of them sat in comfortable silence as the bartender brought their drinks, each lost in their own thoughts about the true nature of niceness and the wisdom of maintaining it. Somewhere in the vast darkness of space, in a region of classified coordinates, thousands of empty bases still stood as silent monuments to the day humanity decided to stop being nice. Their walls still bore that simple message, though few were ever allowed to see it. And if the Ninthar Empire's diplomatic corps now included a special division dedicated solely to maintaining good relations with humanity, well, that was just them being nice. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. There are things far more terrifying than violence, and species that are nice by choice, rather than necessity. Some say that's why humans make such effective diplomats. They understand, better than most, that true power lies not in demonstrating strength, but in having the luxury of choosing not to. As for what actually happened to those Canthar warriors during those 3 months, well, that's still classified at the highest levels. But if you ever meet a retired Canthar warrior and ask them about humans, pay attention to their reaction. They don't show fear. Canthar warriors fear nothing, after all. But they do show something that looks remarkably like respect, and they're always, always very nice about it. Sarah took a small sip of her drink, actual Earth whiskey, a luxury item in this part of the galaxy, and studied her companions with that peculiarly human expression that somehow managed to be both completely open and utterly unreadable. "You know," she said casually, "I couldn't help but overhear parts of your earlier conversation about niceness." She smiled, and for a brief moment Carax was reminded of something he'd once seen in a nature documentary about Earth predators. It's interesting how many species seem to fixate on that particular trait of ours. Vexthra's scales rippled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "And what do humans think about this fixation?" "Oh, we find it rather amusing, mostly." Sarah swirled her whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Though I suppose it does get a bit tedious sometimes, having to constantly reassure everyone that we're not plotting their imminent doom just because we believe in solving problems through dialogue first." "First?" Carax's antennae twitched at her word choice. "That implies there's a second option." "There's always a second option," Sarah said, her tone still light and conversational. "We just prefer not to discuss it over drinks. Seems impolite, you know?" A Mercian merchant captain who had been quietly nursing a drink at the next table suddenly stood up, paid their bill, and quickly left the bar. Sarah watched them go with a raised eyebrow. "Case in point," she sighed. Now I'll have to spend next week convincing the Mershan Trade Federation that we're not secretly amassing a fleet to invade their space, again. Are you? Carax asked before he could stop himself. Sarah actually laughed at that, a warm, genuine sound that somehow made Carax even more nervous. Ambassador Carax, if we were planning to invade anyone's space, do you really think we'd need a fleet? The implications of that statement hung in the air like a quantum probability waiting to collapse. You know what I find fascinating? Sarah continued, apparently oblivious to the effect her words had had on her companions. How many species seem to think that being nice is somehow mutually exclusive with being dangerous, as if kindness is only genuine when it comes from weakness. That's actually a very profound observation, Vexthra said, her scales shifting through thoughtful patterns of blue and green. Indeed, Sarah agreed. Though I suppose I understand the confusion. Most species evolved in environments where showing strength was necessary for survival. Earth required a different approach. When everything on your planet is trying to kill you, you quickly learn that adding to the violence rarely solves anything. Is that why humans are so focused on diplomatic solutions? Carax asked, genuinely curious now. Because you had to learn better ways to handle conflict? Partially, Sarah said. But it's more than that. We learned that the true art of survival isn't about being the strongest or the most aggressive. It's about knowing when to be nice, and when not to be. She reached into her diplomatic pouch and pulled out a small crystalline data chip, sliding it across the table to Vexthra. Speaking of which, your description of the Radek incident was mostly accurate, but you missed some key details. This contains the full, unclassified report. Consider it a gesture of trust between friends. Vexthra's scales went almost white with shock. But this is still classified at the highest levels. Was classified, Sarah corrected gently. As of about 6 hours ago, when the last of the involved parties agreed to lift the information embargo. Coincidentally, right after my very productive meeting with the HFY consortium. Carax's mandibles worked soundlessly for a moment as he processed the implications. The HFY, they were involved with the Kenthar during the Hradek incident? Now that would be telling, Sarah said with another one of those predator smiles. But let's just say that today's trade agreement included some very specific clauses about historical data sharing and accountability. She finished her whiskey and stood, smoothing her diplomatic uniform with practiced ease. I should get going. Early meeting tomorrow with the Galactic Heritage Foundation about preserving some interesting archaeological sites we've discovered. Apparently, Earth wasn't the only death world to produce sapient life. Just the only one where the species survived long enough to reach the stars. As she turned to leave, she paused and looked back at them. Oh, and about those Kenthar warriors? They weren't gone for 3 months. From their perspective, it was only about 3 minutes. Time, like niceness, is largely a matter of perspective, she winked. But that's classified too. Or at least, it will be for another few hours. After she left, Carax and Vexthra sat in stunned silence, staring at the data chip that promised answers but probably only held more questions. Finally, Carax spoke. You know what really pisses me off about humans? He said, unconsciously echoing his words from earlier. What's that? Vexthra asked, her scales still showing traces of shock white. They're just so nice about everything, even when they're terrifying the scales off you. The data chip sat between them, a tiny crystal containing secrets that had shaped galactic politics for decades. Neither of them reached for it immediately. Some truths, they silently agreed, were best absorbed with proper preparation, and possibly more drinks. In the end, they ordered another round and spent the next hour discussing everything except what was on that chip. It seemed like the polite thing to do, the nice thing even. And somewhere in the diplomatic quarter of the station, Sarah Chen was reviewing reports about those newly discovered archaeological sites. Sites that showed clear evidence of multiple civilizations that had destroyed themselves trying to weaponize their own evolutionary advantages. Sites that helped explain why humans had learned early on that being nice wasn't just an option, it was a survival strategy. Because sometimes, the nicest thing you can do is remind people why being nice is preferable to the alternatives. 3 days later, Carax found himself standing in the observation lounge of his private diplomatic quarters, staring out at the endless expanse of space while trying to process what he'd learned from the data chip. Behind him, Vexthra's scales were cycling through colors so rapidly it was starting to give him a headache. It just doesn't make sense, he chittered, mandibles clicking in agitation. How could they possibly have— Don't, Vexthra interrupted sharply. We agreed not to discuss the specifics. Ever. Carax's antennae drooped slightly. Yes, you're right. Though I notice humans don't seem to have any problem casually dropping hints about it. That's because they're nice? Karak suggested dryly. I was going to say terrifying, but I suppose nice works too. Vexthra settled into one of the gravity-adjusted loungers. Did you see the new advisory from the USC Cultural Integration Committee? Karax turned away from the viewport. No, what now? They're recommending all member species update their first contact protocols. Apparently there's been some concern about how we present ourselves to newly discovered civilizations. Let me guess, humans suggested this? Actually, no. The Kenthar did. Vexthra's scales shifted to a deep blue of amusement. They said, and I quote, "It would be in everyone's best interest to ensure new species understand the importance of diplomatic courtesy from the beginning." Karax made a sound that in his species passed for a snort. The Kenthar, advocating for diplomatic courtesy. If you'd told me that 30 cycles ago, I'd have had you checked for neural parasites. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from Karax's communication console. A message scrolled across the screen. Priority Diplomatic Bulletin. From Office of Human Relations. Project Heritage. Classification, Open Source. Well, that's new, Karax muttered, accessing the message. They never send open source bulletins about anything important. As they read through the document, both aliens felt their respective respiratory organs constrict. The bulletin was brief, written in that peculiarly straightforward way humans had of delivering world-shattering information. Following recent archaeological discoveries, the Human Diplomatic Corps wishes to inform all USC member species that we will be hosting an open symposium on extinct civilizations and evolutionary dead ends. Particular focus will be given to species that achieve technological advancement without developing corresponding social mechanisms for conflict resolution. Attendance is entirely voluntary. Refreshments will be served. For those interested in a preview of the material, please see attached files regarding the fate of the Nexor Collective, a species that achieved Type 2 civilization status before destroying themselves in an attempt to forcibly optimize their neural pathways for aggression. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore, are they? Karax said weakly. Oh, I think they're being very subtle, Vexthra replied, her scales now showing bands of thoughtful green and cautionary yellow. Notice how they're making it open source, available to everyone, even non-USC species? Including the Drex hegemony, Karax realized. The Drex had been making increasingly aggressive moves lately, pushing boundaries, testing defenses. Very much like the Kenthar of old. This isn't just a symposium. It's a warning. A very nice warning, Vexthra agreed. Complete with refreshments. Karax's communications console chimed again. This time it was a personal message from Sarah Chen. Hope you'll be able to attend the symposium. I think you'll find the section on parallel evolution particularly interesting. Especially the part about how different species developed different definitions of strength based on their environmental challenges. By the way, that data chip you received, consider it a preview of our presentation on temporal mechanics and their applications in cultural education. The Kenthar have graciously agreed to provide testimonials. Should be fun! P.S. The refreshments will include authentic Earth cuisine. Don't worry, we've adjusted the capsaicin levels to be safe for non-Death Worlders. We're nice like that. Karax read the message twice before turning to Vexthra. You know what really terrifies me about humans? Their ability to manipulate space-time, their casual approach to physics-defying technology, their disturbing habit of discovering ancient civilizations that coincidentally prove their points about diplomatic relations. No, Karax said, his mandibles twitching in what might have been a smile. The fact that they genuinely mean it when they say they want everyone to get along. They're not being nice because it's diplomatic. They're not even being nice because it's strategic. They're being nice because they actually believe the galaxy would be better if everyone just learned to be nice. And if someone doesn't want to be nice, then they get invited to very educational symposiums with adjusted capsaicin levels. Karax started drafting his RSVP. You know, I think I'm finally understanding why Earth's most successful predators were the ones that learned to hunt in cooperative packs. Oh? Because the ones that didn't learn to cooperate had to deal with primitive humans. And humans... He paused, mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Humans have always been very nice about explaining why cooperation is preferable to the alternatives. Somewhere in the depths of space, archaeologists were carefully documenting the remains of civilizations that had never learned that lesson. And humans, being humans, were preparing to share those findings in the nicest way possible. With refreshments, because that's what nice people do. even if they're also the most terrifying species in known space. Especially if they're the most terrifying species in known space. The symposium was held in the Grand Convention Center of Unity Station, a massive structure designed to accommodate species from every known environmental classification. Carax found himself seated in the diplomats section, surrounded by representatives from across the galaxy. The tension in the room was palpable. Despite the soothing environmental controls and the promised refreshments arranged on anti-grav platforms that floated serenely between the different gravity sections. A Drex representative sat 2 rows ahead, their crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the ambient light in patterns that suggested barely contained agitation. They had come, despite their government's public dismissal of the symposium as Deathworlder propaganda. Carax wondered if they knew what they were about to witness. Sarah Chen took the stage, or rather the central hovering platform that served as one, with that same warm smile she always wore. She was dressed in the formal black and silver of the human diplomatic corps, but had accessorized with pins representing various USC member species. Carax noticed she was wearing a Kenthar military insignia, which was unprecedented. "Welcome, friends and colleagues," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the universal translators. "Before we begin our discussion of archaeological findings, I'd like to share a story. It's a human story, but I think you'll find it relevant." The room quieted. Even the Drex representative's crystalline surfaces stilled. On Earth, there's an old saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It means to be gentle in approach while maintaining the capacity for force. For a long time, many humans misinterpreted this as simple gunboat diplomacy. She paused, her smile taking on that predatory edge Carax had come to recognize. They missed the most important part. Speaking softly comes first. Holographic displays activated around the room, showing images of Earth's wildlife. Predators and prey, existing in complex ecosystems. On our world, we learned something fascinating. The most successful predators weren't always the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who learned when not to use their strength. The ones who understood that conservation of energy, being nice, if you will, was often more advantageous than constant displays of power. The images shifted to show various human historical periods, each depicting different forms of conflict and resolution. "But here's what's really interesting," Sarah continued, casually tapping her datapad. New images appeared, the archaeological sites she'd mentioned. "We've discovered this pattern isn't unique to Earth. Every species that achieved sustainable technological advancement went through a similar revelation. Those that didn't..." The holographs shifted again, showing the ruins of civilizations that had destroyed themselves. The Drex representative's crystalline surface began showing stress patterns. "Now, I know what some of you are thinking," Sarah said, still smiling. "This is just humans trying to push their philosophy on everyone else. Being nice about it, but pushing nonetheless." She touched the Kenthar insignia on her lapel. "So I'd like to invite a special guest to share their perspective." A massive figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the stage. A Kenthar warrior, bearing the marks of high military rank. Carax heard several diplomats gasp. The warrior's ceremonial armor was decorated with symbols that marked them as one of the survivors of the Hradek incident. "This is Supreme Commander Vikathar," Sarah introduced them. "They've graciously agreed to share their experience regarding the benefits of diplomatic cooperation." The Kenthar stepped forward, their massive form dwarfing the human beside them. When they spoke, their voice carried the weight of someone who had seen things that defied explanation. "I once believed as many of you do," they began, mandibles clicking in a pattern that indicated deep emotional resonance. "That power was meant to be displayed. That strength was measured in conquest. Then humans taught me otherwise." They turned to look directly at the Drex representative. "They taught all of us. Some learned quickly. Others required additional education." The Drex's crystalline surface was now showing clear stress fractures. "The humans have a saying," Vakthar continued. "Time heals all wounds." We didn't understand the full implications of that phrase until after the Hradek incident. Now we understand many things about time, about healing, about wounds. Their mandibles clicked in what Carax recognized as dark amusement, about how very, very nice humans can be about teaching these lessons. Sarah stepped forward again. "Thank you, Supreme Commander. Now, let's discuss those archaeological findings. Particularly interesting is the site we've designated Heritage Point Alpha. It appears to have belonged to a species that achieved quantum manipulation capabilities before developing basic conflict resolution protocols. The results were, well, Let's just say they're still technically there, just spread across several parallel timelines. The presentation continued, each revelation more unsettling than the last. Krax noticed that Sarah kept glancing at various chronometers around the room, as if waiting for something. The Drex representative was now showing fracture patterns that suggested they were close to molecular destabilization from stress. Finally, Sarah held up a hand, pausing the presentation. Right on schedule. If you'll all direct your attention to your personal data feeds, you should be receiving an interesting update from the Drex border region. Krax checked his feed. His mandibles clicked in shock as he read the report. The Drex fleet that had been massing along the human border had disappeared. Not destroyed, not defeated, simply gone. The Drex representative's crystalline surface was now emanating a high-pitched frequency of distress. "Don't worry," Sarah said cheerfully to the room, but looking directly at the Drex representative. "They're fine. They're just taking a brief, educational tour. They should return in about 3 minutes of their subjective time, though I believe from our perspective it might take 3 months. Temporal mechanics can be so tricky. Don't you agree, Supreme Commander?" The Canthar warrior's mandibles clicked in what might have been a laugh. "Indeed, though I'm sure the humans will be very nice about explaining everything when they return." "Of course we will," Sarah agreed. "We're always nice about these things. Now, who's ready for refreshments? We have some lovely Earth delicacies called chocolate chip cookies. They're quite harmless, I assure you. Unless you're carbon-silicon hybrid lifeforms, in which case we have appropriate alternatives. We're nice like that." As the anti-grav platforms began distributing refreshments, Krax turned to Vexthra, who had been unusually quiet throughout the presentation. Her scales had settled into a pattern he had never seen before, a swirling mixture of awe and resignation. "You know what really terrifies me about humans now?" he asked. "That they can manipulate time itself to teach object lessons about playing nice with others?" "No," Krax said, accepting a cookie from a passing platform. "That they genuinely believe everyone will eventually learn to be nice, even if they have to rearrange the fundamental forces of the universe to teach them how." Somewhere in the depths of space, a Drex fleet was about to learn a very important lesson about diplomacy, courtesy, and why humans spent so much energy being nice. And when they returned, they would undoubtedly be invited to another lovely symposium, with refreshments, because humans were nice like that. And the galaxy was finally beginning to understand why that was the most terrifying thing about them. Exactly 3 standard months after the symposium, Krax found himself back at the Wayward Nebula, this time sharing a table with Sarah Chen and a Drex diplomat whose crystalline structure still showed faint traces of stress patterns. The Drex, who had introduced themselves as Observer First Class Extil, hadn't touched their specially synthesized nutrient solution. "You have to understand," Extil was saying, their voice modulated to a frequency that suggested barely contained existential dread. "We thought we understood warfare. We thought we understood power. We were incorrect." Sarah sipped her whiskey with that same pleasant smile she always wore. "Oh, how so?" The Drex's crystalline surface rippled with remembered terror. "You showed our fleet possibilities, alternatives, things that could have been, things that might still be, things that—" They paused, their translation matrix seemingly struggling to find appropriate words. "Things that were nice." Krax's antennae twitched with interest. This was the first time any of the returned Drex had publicly spoken about their experience. "And what did you learn from these possibilities?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer, but was being polite enough to let Extil say it themselves. "We learned that what you call nice is not what we thought it was." Extil's crystal matrix pulsed with patterns that indicated deep philosophical disturbance. "You showed us a future where the Drex hegemony chose cooperation over conquest, where we achieved things we had never imagined possible because we worked with other species instead of trying to dominate them." "Sounds lovely," Sarah commented, signaling the bartender for another round. "It was horrible," Extil whispered, "because then you showed us all the futures where we didn't choose cooperation, where we continued on our current path, where we—" Their crystalline structure emitted a high-pitched keen of distress, "where we encountered things that were not nice, things that humans keep locked away because you are too nice to use them." Krax felt his primary heart skip a beat. Things like what happened to the Kenther warriors. Extil accepted the box with the careful movements of someone handling antimatter. "Thank you, you are very nice." "We try to be," Sarah agreed. "It's so much better than the alternatives, isn't it?" The Drex's only response was a subtle shift in their crystalline resonance that somehow managed to convey complete and total agreement. Later, after Extil had excused themselves to report back to their superiors, Carax turned to Sarah. You know what really fascinates me about humans now? Our chocolate, she suggested innocently. The fact that you've weaponized niceness itself. You don't just use it as a diplomatic tool or a moral philosophy. You've turned it into the most terrifying force in the galaxy. Sarah's smile took on that familiar predatory edge. Now whatever would give you that idea, Ambassador? Perhaps the fact that you've managed to convince the most aggressive species in known space to voluntarily join the USC by being so nice that they're terrified of ever encountering anything that isn't nice? Ah, Sarah said, finishing her whiskey. Well, as we say on Earth, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I don't know what either of those substances are, Carax admitted, but I'm going to assume the metaphor involves being nice. Everything involves being nice, Ambassador. That's the point. She stood, straightening her uniform. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the HFY consortium about their recent archaeological discoveries. Apparently, they've found something interesting in their home system. Something that suggests they might have had neighbors once. Neighbors who weren't very nice. Worse, Extil said. So much worse. The Kenthar incident was just humans being educational. What they showed us were the things they choose not to do. The capabilities they choose not to use. The powers they choose to keep contained because they are too nice to inflict them on the galaxy. Sarah's smile hadn't wavered, but there was something in her eyes that made Carax's exoskeleton want to molt prematurely. Every species has choices to make, she said cheerfully. We just believe in helping others make informed decisions. By showing them horrors beyond comprehension? Carax asked before he could stop himself. Oh no, Sarah laughed. Those weren't horrors. Those were just possibilities. Actual horrors are things we keep classified. We're nice like that. Extil's crystal matrix vibrated with what might have been a shudder. The hegemony has revised its diplomatic protocols. We will be submitting an application for USC membership next cycle. It seems prudent. How wonderful, Sarah beamed. We'll be happy to sponsor your application. I'm sure you'll find the USC quite welcoming. We're all very nice here. The Drex diplomat finally reached for their drink, their crystalline manipulators trembling slightly. Yes, nice. We are learning to appreciate nice. Speaking of nice, Sarah said, reaching into her diplomatic pouch. I brought something to celebrate this moment. She pulled out a small box. Earth chocolates. Don't worry, these are specially formulated to be safe for silicon-based life forms. Extil accepted the box with the careful movements of someone handling antimatter. Thank you. You are very nice. We try to be, Sarah agreed. It's so much better than the alternatives, isn't it? The Drex's only response was a subtle shift in their crystalline resonance that somehow managed to convey complete and total agreement. Later, after Extil had excused themselves to report back to their superiors, Carax turned to Sarah. You know what really fascinates me about humans now? Our chocolate, she suggested innocently. The fact that you've weaponized niceness itself. You don't just use it as a diplomatic tool or a moral philosophy. You've turned it into the most terrifying force in the galaxy. Sarah's smile took on that familiar predatory edge. Now whatever would give you that idea, Ambassador? Perhaps the fact that you've managed to convince the most aggressive species in known space to voluntarily join the USC by being so nice that they're terrified of ever encountering anything that isn't nice? Ah, Sarah said, finishing her whiskey. Well, as we say on Earth, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I don't know what either of those substances are, Carax admitted, but I'm going to assume the metaphor involves being nice. Everything involves being nice, Ambassador. That's the point. She stood, straightening her uniform. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the HFY consortium about their recent archaeological discoveries. Apparently, they've found something interesting in their home system. Something that suggests they might have had neighbors once. Neighbors who weren't